Hello, and welcome to the third and final episode of our special three-part edition of Ethics Express, where we're discussing the topic of government ethics laws in principle and in practice. In the first episode, we discussed the general history and purpose of government ethics laws. In the second episode, we discussed the structure of a good ethics law. And now, in this third and final episode, we'll discuss the specifics of what an ethics agency does. Here joining us today to finish this discussion is Mark Davies. Mark is the Executive Director of the New York City Conflicts of Interest Board and the Chair of the New York State Bar Association Municipal Law Section. So Mark, let's get into this. What does an ethics agency do?
Well, essentially it has four substantive duties. The first is to provide legal advice, which in those jurisdictions that have waiver authority would include waivers as well. Legal advice must be not only accurate, it also must be timely. Advice that is delayed is effectively advice that is denied. So prompt legal advice is really critical. It may be oral, it may be written. The second function, the second duty of an effective ethics board is training and education. Now, as our Director of Training Education has often said, live training is by far the most effective training, but is also by far the most inefficient. So you must supplement live training with other forms of training. It could be, for example, DVDs. It could be materials posted on your website. It could be posters. But in particular, it probably also would include some kind of web-based interactive training program.
Okay, so two duties of an ethics board are legal advice and training. And what are the other two duties?
Well, thirdly is administration of the disclosure system. And in particular, that will involve administration of the annual disclosure system, which would require that the forms, the annual disclosure forms, be distributed, that they be collected either electronically or in hard copy, that they be made available to the public, in particular to the media, because after all, it's the media and the public that are really, in a sense, enforcing these laws by ferreting out where the conflicts of interest exist. And of course, it would also require that the administration of the financial disclosure law fine those persons who don't file or file late. And then finally, the fourth duty is enforcement. An ethics board must have enforcement power, including the power to impose civil fines, because without that, it is simply a toothless tiger to which no one is likely to pay too much attention because they don't have the power to enforce what they say. The ethics board in its enforcement function must have the power to commence investigations on its own without waiting for any kind of complaint. It must have the power to prosecute violations, civilly prosecute violations, and the board members themselves must have the power to impose civil fines, and you would hope the power to require the disgorgement of ill-gotten gains.
All right, four distinct and important duties for an ethics board. Now, Mark, at this point, we've heard from you about a whole variety of techniques and principles for maintaining an effective system of ethics regulation in a jurisdiction. I think our viewers would find it very interesting to hear from you, the Executive Director of the New York City Conflicts of Interest Board, about how you feel our jurisdiction stacks up in terms of these principles. Let's start with the clear, comprehensive ethics code. How do you feel New York City does in terms of its ethics code?
Well, with two exceptions, New York City's ethics code or conflicts of interest law is very, very good. It's excellent. It meets all those principles that we talked about. It has all the critical provisions and a number of others that are important as well. The two exceptions are, first of all, it's really too complicated. Unfortunately, in certain situations, a public servant can't interpret the law itself and would therefore need to call up our board and get legal advice. Luckily, it's available whenever we're open. The other exception is that the New York City Conflicts of Interest law does not include those values that we talked about. It's solely compliance-based. So it also should have added, probably to its preamble, those values for an ethical public servant.
So perhaps the New York City law could be closer to this hybrid model that you discussed in a previous episode that combines a compliance-based approach with a values-based approach. Now let's discuss our annual disclosure law. How does that stack up?
Well, in terms of substance, and that is in terms of the content of the financial disclosure form, it's not very good at all. In particular, it is unrelated to the conflicts of interest law, so it really violates the most fundamental principles of a good financial disclosure form. It both requires far too much information and in some instances did not require enough information.
All right, and what would be an example of where the New York City law is not tied to the ethics code?
Well, for example, the New York City conflicts of interest law permits you as a public servant to take an action that would benefit a corporation in which you own less than $10,000 in stock or bonds. On the other hand, the financial disclosure law requires that you disclose all of your interest in corporations, stocks and bonds and so forth, valued at $1,000 or more. And yet, between $1,000 and $9,999, there can't be any conflict of interest with that ownership. So why are we requiring disclosure of that information? All it does is gum up the works when you want to analyze these forms.
Okay, and so now at this point we've heard how New York City stacks up in terms of two of the three pillars, the clear and comprehensive ethics code and a system of disclosure. Now what about the third pillar, administration by an independent board? How does the New York City Conflicts of Interest Board stack up in terms of the necessary independence?
Again, very, very well, with one glaring exception. All those indicators, all those indicia that we talked about of an independent ethics board are present in New York City, with that one exception. For example, the mayor can appoint a member of the board only with the advice and consent of the city council. At least twice during my tenure, very early in my tenure, the council refused to confirm a mayoral nomination. So that advice and consent function is really it's real, and it helps ensure that our ethics board's members are of the highest caliber, and also that they are independent. So that's very good. The other indicators in terms of volunteers and so on are also present in New York City. In terms of our ethics board, they also help promote the independence of the board. The one glaring exception that I mentioned is the lack of an independent budget. Now, admittedly, thus far, Mayor de Blasio and his predecessor, Mayor Bloomberg, have been very good to us on the budget, no question about it. And yet, any future mayor at any time could defund the Conflicts of Interest Board and effectively destroy ethics enforcement, ethics advice, ethics training, ethics regulation in the city of New York. So it is absolutely critical that before that ever happens, we have an independent, that is, a protected budget.
Okay, so clearly room for some improvement, but it's good to hear from you that in general you feel the board measures up in terms of best practices in ensuring an independent ethics board in New York City. Let's talk now about those 4 duties of an ethics board. Tell us how the New York City Conflicts of Interest Board measures up there.
Again, very, very well. In terms of legal advice, we have a function that probably doesn't exist in a lot of ethics boards. That is, as I mentioned, that any public servant, and there are 300,000 public servants in New York City, any one of them, any day of the week that we are open during office hours, they can call up our general number and they can speak to an attorney and ask that attorney for advice as to whether they can or cannot do something. And they can get an immediate answer 9 times out of 10. 1 time out of 10, it'll be a new issue, or they'll need a waiver, and they'll have to write in. But the vast majority of the time, they can get an immediate answer on the phone. So that's an incredible service. So that works very, very well. And we'll get this year almost 5,000 phone calls. Secondly is the training education function. We only have 4 trainers, and yet they are doing an excellent job of training 300,000 public servants. Now again, we can only train about 20,000 public servants live each year. But beyond that, we have a broad range, a very broad range of materials that are available on or through our website, posters and plain language guides and so forth. And then in addition, we are working right now on creating and posting on our website an interactive web-based training program that every official would be required to complete once every 2 years. So the training education function is terrific, including the videos like this one here. The third duty of an effective ethics board is administration of the disclosure system. Again, that is done very, very well. We have a compliance rate that is close to 100% in terms of filers. If they don't file, we go after them quickly. Every single form of the roughly 8,500 forms that are filed with us, every single form is reviewed for potential conflicts of interest, in particular to determine if the filer has an interest in a company that does business with New York City, which is prohibited, and so we would contact them and not fine them, but give them the opportunity to either get a waiver or to resign that outside position. And then finally, enforcement. Our board is very effective in its enforcement function. Each year we will find about 80 public servants in violation of the conflicts of interest law. Many of those will result in fines, roughly $150,000, $160,000 a year in fines. In addition, there'll be a number of private warning letters which don't result in fines. The other indicators of an effective enforcement system exist in New York City. We have the power to initiate investigations on our own and so forth. Probably the only possible problem is that we do not have the power to investigate with our own investigators. We, by law, are required to use the Department of Investigation. Department of Investigation does just an excellent, first-rate job in investigating for us, but they're a separate agency. And so of necessity, because they're a separate agency, we don't have the kind of control over investigations that we would have if we had our own investigators in-house, at least for smaller cases. But with that, relatively minor exception, overall, the New York City Conflicts of Interest Board has just a very, very effective administration.
All right, and there you have it. How New York City is doing according to the Executive Director of New York City's Ethics Agency. So Mark, I think we're about ready to wrap up, but I wanted to ask, do you have any final thoughts on government ethics laws before we close?
Well, maybe 2 final thoughts. One is that, we have these visitors from other countries. Sometimes they'll say, we hear this, but, you're talking about people accepting free tickets to a football game. We're worrying about people stuffing cash in their pockets. So why should we worry about conflicts of interest as opposed to outright corruption, bribes, kickbacks, and so on? And my answer is, well, of all your public servants, how many would you say are corrupt? How many, let's put it the other way around, how many are honest? And even the most corrupt nation in the world will say, well, probably 99% of our public servants are honest and want to do the right thing. And so my question to them is, so what are you doing for the 99%? That's the question. What are you doing for your honest public servants? Are you providing them with the guidance they require to do the right thing, to stay honest? Are you providing them with the protection that an effective ethics law provides for subordinates against superiors, for public servants against those on the outside that try to corrupt them? Are you providing that kind of protection? So those are critical questions. The fact is that an ethics board, a conflicts of interest agency, can really essentially act as an oasis in a desert of corruption. This little small agency can be an agency that the entire population, that all the people can see this works. These people are honest, they have integrity, they're helping keep our government honest. So with all that corruption, you can have this little oasis of integrity in the midst of it. The final point is that if you're going to do this ethics stuff, you have to do it right. You have to have those 3 pillars in place and so forth. Because if you don't, all you do is undermine public's confidence in government instead of promoting it. So ethics laws, they're critical, but if you do it right.
Okay, thank you for sharing those last thoughts, Mark. I think as we've seen, setting up a government ethics system is not without difficulties, but is well worth the effort. I think this is a good place to wrap up. Thank you for joining us, Mark.
Thank you, Phil.
And thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time.